The title of my talk is Plus ça change, and it's from the French saying that translates as the more things change, the more things stay the same. And this year I have had a number of invitations to revisit the 2008 research, the book that was published, Marketing, Dictatorship, Propaganda and Thought Work in Contemporary China, and then further work I did was a book called China's Thought Management, and consider that work in the context of the policies of Xi Jinping and his government, because there's been a lot of media attention on how, and since late 2012, Xi Jinping's government has strengthened social, political and economic controls. Xi Jinping has, in 2012, December 2012, he set the new direction in a secret speech when he raised the example of the breakup of the Soviet Union, which he said was caused by a belief crisis, that the Soviet people had lost faith with the Communist Party. And then a few months later, President Xi, or Xi Jinping, was talking about the beliefs and faith as the calcium of the CCP members, and saying that without them they will develop rickets. And so he has made a number of public statements, and his own leaders working with him have made many statements emphasising the importance of propaganda and thought work. And we even have he's come up with his own package of ideology, as indeed all the most senior leader in the Chinese political system must do. Xi's is the four comprehensives, and that's can be translated as the Chinese dream, economic development, rule by law, and cleaning up corruption within the party. And unlike the Mao era, Chinese people don't need to memorise these points. And you'll note that they're very apolitical or depoliticised compared to the kind of ideology that was promoted in China in the past. And then as part of this re-emphasis on strengthening propaganda and thought work, there's also been a number of strong statements from officials about the threat of so-called domestic and foreign hostile forces. And also there's been talk about the pernicious influence of, quote, the ideology of Western anti-China forces. And so it's this these sorts of tropes that have led to a lot of commentary that something new is happening under Xi Jinping. But I have argued in a number of talks and papers that I'm writing this year, and also commentary that you might have seen in the Financial Times, that these are tired old phrases that we've heard many times before, and it's very familiar that when a new bunch of leaders come to power, that the most senior leader has to set a new ideological line. We saw it under Hu Jintao, we saw it under Jiang Zemin. Jiang Zemin, it was stress politics, and was his saying. And I remember I was doing my PhD research at the time, and people talked about Jiang Zemin is it a turn to the left? Both Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao conducted crackdowns on corruption. Both of them tightened up controls, political and social controls, and to some extent economic controls. And there is a difference, of course, with Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping has at his disposal a lot more financial resources than either Jiang Zemin or Hu Jintao had. And a further difference is that Xi Jinping has a lot more power concentrated in his hands than either Hu Jintao or Jiang Zemin had. And then there's another additional difference, which is not so much a difference related directly to China, but more about the media environment that we operate in now. When I did my research on the foreign affairs system in China and on the propaganda system in China, I spent years going to libraries and talking to people and assiduously gathering paper materials. And in a recent paper that I wrote about China's modernised propaganda system that will appear in the China Quarterly later this year, called How China Frames Taiwan, all I had to do was to seek online what, to my great surprise, I was initially just looking for what academic research there might be in Chinese about the topic of Taiwan and propaganda. But to my amazement, I discovered that regulations that previously, I mean, they are still classified regulations, but now they're available saturation on the internet, the TIFA, the correct TIFA, or political phraseology, which you must use for Taiwan. And so, and there's reasons for that, but when it comes to analysing what's happening in China at the moment, and whether or not the government is doing anything significantly different from previous leadership, many other researchers also now can access materials that previously were very hard to get to. And you can have people within China with just one click can be sending out instructions from the Central Propaganda Department. So we know things now in real time and at a level of, just like all the other information in our life, a level of complexity that I think is another factor that is increasing, that is making people think that something different is going on in China, when in fact more people are able to have access to sort of materials that I had to spend a long time finding out. And it strikes me that in interpreting what's going on in China today, our journalists who are writing the most so far, because it's happening, it's quite recent, we haven't got a lot of scholarly writing on this, are perhaps lacking the historical perspective. So, and I mentioned the Xi Tong and why that's important. And the talk of the domestic and foreign hostile forces, these are typical phrases of the Wai Shi Xi Tong, the foreign affairs system. I don't know if you all know what a Xi Tong is. It's a super bureaucracy. You could call it a policy area. And China has groups, key policies within these Xi Tong. It's not a top-down structure. And so Xi Jinping is in charge of overseeing both the propaganda and thought work Xi Tong, as well as the foreign affairs Xi Tong. And Xi has been quite frank in recent speeches about the challenges that China faces, both the domestic and external challenges China faces. At a recent meeting, a couple of meetings of the Wai Shi, he has stressed this. So again, to preface my remarks of what I'm going to be talking about, the body of what I've been talking about today, you are seeing at the moment, I think, in China a blending, as China is more open to the outside world than it ever was before. Foreign affairs becomes more important than before, and that doesn't mean China becomes more closed off. The dictum on this was set long ago by Deng Xiaoping in the early 80s, when there was, as China was beginning to open up to the West and more conservative forces were getting concerned about negative influences coming in, and other voices were saying, well, you know, we don't want to go back to what we had in the 1970s. And Deng Xiaoping said of Wai Shi that, and how to deal with the outside world, that the goal was to open the window but to keep the flies and mosquitoes out. So the foreign affairs system, the regulations and approaches to managing foreigners are like a fine mosquito net that keeps out the negative aspects. So similarly, this government is not xenophobic. They don't want to encourage xenophobia. They want to manage Sino-foreign contact in the interests of maintaining political stability. So, and persuasion, or in Chinese terms, 宣传, propaganda, play an important role in that. And again, there's a further difference from, say, the 1980s or before, where there was a sharp difference between internal and external propaganda. The message directed at Chinese and the message directed at foreigners. Now, thanks to the internet, you know, it's a bonus for those who want to spread their message. You can get a lot of information freely available to all around the world. And China has had a project of e-governance for quite a number of years now. But what that means is that the boundaries between the message directed at Chinese population and that direct towards the foreigners is no longer so clear-cut. So again, the foreign affairs and propaganda are intermingling here and where they might not have been before. So that's the preface to what I want to share with you. I want to show with you today, I want to share a little bit about why I'm arguing that why what we're seeing now in China is actually not so different as what we might think. And the project that which became the book Marketing Dictatorship, was, like so much of my research, it was benefited from a lucky, a serendipitous experience. And by chance, I heard an interview with a researcher based at Hunter College called Stuart Ewan, and he was talking about his book, PR, which is, describes the history of the development of public relations in the United States. And through Professor Ewan's work, I learned about figures such as Harold Lasswell, whose 1927 thesis, PhD thesis, was on the Creel Commission, which was persuading the American public to accept US government's entry into World War I, and other scholars like Walter Lippmann and Edward Bernays. And these theorists believed that democracy is mob rule and the population they cannot be relied on to make sensible decisions when it comes to politics, and the job of governments is to help mould public opinion, to regiment the public mind, to manufacture consent. And what I heard Professor Ewan talking about resonated with what I'd already been reading in Chinese about what was going on in the propaganda system. And what was so interesting to me, and it was a real revelation as I was realising that the mistake I was making in my early forays in trying to understand the propaganda system in China, is I was looking through it with New Zealand eyes instead of trying to accept what I found, try to go there and understand what I found there. And Professor Ewan's book helped me because I recognised some of the things he was talking about, that I'd been coming across them in Chinese and not understanding them properly. And when I went and did interviews in China, to my amazement, I learned that Harold Lasswell, Walter Lippmann, Edward Bernays were well-known figures and very influential amongst those who were seeking to transform China's propaganda system. Now, I should say that propaganda is not a bad word in Chinese. It is in English. I mean, it's increasingly become an ordinary discourse as to talk about something as 宣传 that has the same connotations as in English. But for the Chinese Communist Party, propaganda is a legitimate task, an important task, indeed the lifeblood of the party is what they call it. And it's long been an established part of party policy. But it has, by the end of the late 1970s, the practices that have been followed in the Mao years were recognised as harmful and dangerous, not being able to support the party. And the 1980s was a very interesting experimental era where all sorts of ideas came into China, and there was talk of modernising the propaganda system. And the materials that I was initially reading were from the 1980s. But I found when I went to China in the 1990s, and when I started this research is from around, well, it was part of my doctoral research on the foreign affairs system in the mid-90s, but I was interviewing about the propaganda system in the 2000s. And when I said 现代化, modernization, people said, no, no, no. Because that was a term from the 1980s. I eventually learnt you have to use the right tifa when you're doing your research in China, or else you have to use the right political term, or else your interlocutors will not give you, I may not even answer your questions whatsoever, because you're putting them or making assumptions using those kind of words that create certain assumptions. So Harold Lasswell is saying here, he's talking about modern industrialised societies, and he's arguing that unlike the days of the Tsar or the emperor or the king, that force could not be used to control populations, that it must be argument and persuasion. And so he's arguing for the necessity of, you can call it propaganda, you can call it social psychology, you can call it advertising. There's all sorts of names that we use for it in our society. And I found this quote in an internal publication aimed at political cadres in China, and resonating the same concept. The Chinese government has recognised that force is a short-term measure, and persuasion, macro-management are much preferable. This is a chart that I made up of the propaganda system in China, the domestic propaganda system. And the hard lines represent the agencies which are under the direct, that the propaganda department leads. They give them direct instructions. And the dotted lines are those that are guided by the propaganda department. And you may not be able to see it clearly, but I think you'll be able to see this later. If you're interested, it's in my book, Marketing Dictatorship, and it'll be online. You'll see that obviously media, we're not surprised to see in there, culture, publishing, but also sport, health, social science, research, tourism, education, all forms of information communication technology also in there. So it doesn't matter, even things that haven't been invented yet. If it's got a tool of communication, it will be incorporated into China's domestic propaganda system. And I think of it as the sphere, the public sphere, or the world of ideas. It's probably the biggest of the shitong in the Chinese system, because it also includes the PLA and their propaganda departments, which is massive. Although they're somewhat in parallel to the Central Propaganda Department and their activities, but they're all on the same message. And then you have within each party cell, there will be a propaganda department, so at each level of government. So in the Mao era, China was what we call a classic propaganda state, and the task of mass persuasion was to get the Chinese population to accept the norms of the new political order. They were expected to believe in the norms of those of this new order. Mao wanted to create the new China and socialist people. And so that was a massive project of the Mao years. But one of the critiques of the Mao years was ultimately how destructive those endless political campaigns were. And in the 1980s, as I said, was a very experimental era, but as a number of Western scholars, Lowell Dittmer and Timothy Cheek, argued, and as many Chinese scholars recognised, revolution couldn't any longer be the justification for CCP rule. They were in power now, and an endless emphasis on revolution may not be a wise strategy for government. And the outcome of all these different possibilities that were playing out in the 1980s, as we all know, is the student protest movement of April-June 1989. And the students were reflecting this power struggle behind the scenes. And the outcome of the power struggle was the new leadership core and a new approach to propaganda and thought work. Recognition that the strategy followed under the leadership of Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang, who had stressed the economy and been silent on propaganda and thought work, was recognised as not one that could be followed in the future. So the saying of two hands, seizing with two hands, both hands must be strong. And one of the hands is economic development and the other is propaganda and thought work. And even though the same terms are used, propaganda and thought work, it's a very, very different approach from the Mao era. So for a start, talking up the market, promoting economic reform, one of the key messages of from this era on up to the present is that propaganda and thought work, to put it in terms that don't grate so much on the English ear, persuasion, the guiding of public opinion, the censorship boundaries, the topics that can be discussed and that should be promoted. A core theme is the economy, because as you know, a confident market and confident consumers means that people are willing to invest and spend money. And that goes for the Chinese population as well as those outside China who might want to invest or to buy Chinese products. So that was a major, major departure, that propaganda and thought work should be supporting economic development. And then also, on the other hand, that literally, that economic development must support propaganda and thought work. One of the theories that people have had about China is that as the middle class became more substantial, that it would inevitably start to challenge political power in China. And China's policy advisors read that kind of research too. And so there's been some very good research on the Chinese middle class and how they were created through privileged relationships with the party. For example, the way in which people got houses. There was a housing reform, and wife gets one house, husband gets another house, no questions asked, because technically you should only have one per family. So instantly people become middle class. They have two houses, they can rent one out. That's the grey income. And a whole lot of benefits that were given to the Chinese middle class from the 1990s onwards. And so another economic transformation that was very important to propaganda is the commercialization of the media and culture and education in China. And again, the analysis from the field of mass communications outside China was saying, well, very risky, because look, once the media is free of the party, then it will start challenging the party. And there's a very well-known book by Zhao Yuezhi who talks about the Chinese media as between the bottom line and the party line. And her second book, Political Communication, she also shows how, despite commercialization, the Chinese media continue to be managed politically. One of the people that I work with in China, Professor Wang Hadong from Wuhan University, had an analogy that I liked. He talked about China's sandwich media, and I think I imagine from his analogy it's a club sandwich, because in his sandwich the Chinese media is not just between the party line and the bottom line. In between there's a slice of bread, and that's the consumer, or the eye economy as they call it in Chinese. So, and he says that the Chinese media, modern media, must not only serve the political goals, it must be tasty as well. People have to want to consume it. And so this, and surprisingly, this has approach from the modernization and the commercialization of the Chinese media from about 1994 on, and the creating of these great big media conglomerates has been quite successful according to the government's requirements. And another change that happened from the early 90s was this recognition that the party had to reconceptualise itself and to think of itself, as was proposed as early as 1991, as a party in power. So this is a really important difference, because in New Zealand, for example, we have the National Party as the government of the day. They're the party in power. And one day they won't be the party in power. And they have to remember that, and they have to make sure that the voters continue to want to vote them in and support them. Now, China doesn't yet have a ballot box system, but amongst the transformations of the modernised propaganda system is an acute awareness of the importance of public opinion. And along with a whole lot of other techniques from the Western world comes in opinion polling. And indeed the Central Propaganda Department set up a division just to do opinion polling on the Chinese population, work out what the problems are, if possible put a bandage on them before they become too serious. So the very different conceptual changes that began in the early 1990s. And this is a periodisation that I have done of the three phases that I've identified of how things changed. After 1989, there's a period of consolidation where there are quite strict controls on the media, strict controls on information. For example, the field of mass communications was not allowed to be taught in China from 1989 to 1992. And that's because if you're familiar with mass communications, you'll know that a lot of the approaches to mass communications critiquing propaganda, critiquing the manufacturing of consent and all other ways in which various organisations, whether they're corporates or governments, attempt to mould public opinion. And yet there are many approaches in mass communications that can be very useful to the propaganda state or a government that wants to manage the information sphere. And so after 1992, mass communications was reintroduced into China. And I have been based in a school of mass communications at the University of Canterbury for a number of years. And I've often partnered with colleagues in China in mass communications. And the courses that my colleagues teach in New Zealand and the courses that my colleagues in China teach in New Zealand are somewhat different. You could think of them as different wings of one field of study with different emphases and sometimes different choice of terms to, sometimes you can disguise more sort of, in China, some topics that might not normally be acceptable can be disguised under other hats. And I've experienced this myself, a course that my colleagues at the University of Canterbury taught on propaganda and theories around propaganda. My hosts at Wuhan University wanted me to teach it, but not under that name. We called it public diplomacy, and we managed to get away with it under that name. So from 1992 to 2002 is when this fundamental changes are going on in party propaganda work, particularly around the issue of funding and also the introduction of new technology, because China really embraced the internet. It saw its risks. 1989, the crackdown on Falun Gong was one of the examples where the government saw the risk factors of how the internet could be used for groups to organise themselves. But the party began to introduce a whole lot of controls to manage the internet. And famously, Bill Clinton said of China trying to control the internet, good luck. It's like trying to pin Jell-O to a wall. Apparently you can pin Jell-O to a wall. The technology is actually, from the point of view of government, as we know in this country and in every country in the world, and New Zealand's one of the Five Eyes too, we're part of it, the technology takes away all our privacy. And so NSA does it, Chinese government does it too. And so it's an advantage from the point of view of the information communication technology is advantageous for those governments who want to watch their citizens or citizens in other countries too. And so from 2002 onwards, I think that after all these transformations that the CCP was increasingly confident comparative to the earlier era of its ability to maintain hold on power. And it's not to say there weren't problem areas. And the party, as I said, Xi Jinping has made some very frank statements recently about the threats that China faces. And China's had a couple of major crises in recent years and those areas are essentially under lockdown since. And I'm talking about Tibet or the Tibetan areas and Xinjiang. The approach to social and political control followed in those kind of areas is very, very different from what happens in the rest of China. They're experiencing micro control. But the rest of China, it's more like macro management. Well, one of the big challenges for the government in trying to continue to maintain political and social stability in China was this, the economic reform policies had completely transformed the means in which the government maintained contact with the citizenry. And this is what they call propaganda blind spots. You know, if you think about it, before the economic reform policies began, about 97% of the Chinese population worked for some kind of state organisation, you know, whether it was at a local level, a municipal factory, or a state-owned enterprise. 97%. But not now. I mean, there's been massive reform of state-owned enterprises and then the local enterprises. You have, and then many people have taken early retirement, and you have this floating population that's coming into the cities. I mean, China has this artificial measure of population using the hukou, so they would say that they're still under the threshold of by this measure, that they don't yet have so many people living in their cities that they meet the figure of the modern industrialised society, which is around about 60% urban. But if you include the floating population, people who have either rural hukou or they're from some other city but they come and live in Shanghai or Beijing or any other big city, then China now has the numbers of population that makes it a modern industrialised society. And those population, they tend not to be, they don't have a government work unit, they might be working for themselves, they might be working in a factory or some other job, so there's no party cell that's going to give them the party message. They might be living in an apartment whereby they might be able to be receive some message from the residents' association, but they're quite likely, if they're young people, they're not watching TV, they're not listening to radio, and they're not reading the traditional media. They're on their mobile devices and they're watching Korean soap operas and House of Cards and a whole lot of other shows that do not have the party message in them. And even if it's a depoliticised message, they are not getting that message. And so the party is concerned about these propaganda blind spots as one issue that they have to deal with. And all these other workers who are, as I said, they're outside the state-owned system. And then there's the issue that, and these are ongoing issues, of how to make the Chinese media more engaging in comparison with this, this complex marketplace of ideas that Chinese citizens are now exposed to. Even with the Great Firewall in place, Chinese people, if they really want to, they can get access to the software that enabled them to get over the firewall. Recently, in January, there was a big crackdown on the virtual networks, and it appears that for many people, then there's more sort of jigging with the technology. And once again, if you're determined, you can still get get through out of the China internet. But then many people in China are not bothering to do that. They're actually quite satisfied with what's available in Chinese and the Chinese internet. Not everybody wants to read New York Times in Chinese or BBC World Service in Chinese. A lot of people are quite happy with what they want to do online, which is do gaming or instant message their friends or read the Chinese news sites. And that is, the government's been trying very hard to try and make the Chinese media as interesting and attractive as possible, so as not to make Chinese people want to go beyond what's available there. And part of the ways in which they can do that actually is the message. It is again through the message. The other part of propaganda is thought work. And I mentioned the economic message. The other strong message that came from the early 90s was of patriotism, or love the countryism, to translate from the Chinese. And it was a really interesting, from the point of view of working out, does all this investment work, development in 2008, because there were still many, many skeptics looking at what China's trying to do since 1989. And in fact, in my field of Chinese politics, I would classify many scholars as falling within the field of the collapse thesis, is what it's called it, looking to see, saying that this regime is doomed and various reasons why. But in 2008, we saw Chinese young people using the internet to organise around the I Heart China campaign, and it was in response to perceived Western media bias and coverage about the protests in Tibetan areas from March 2008. So it was a bottom-up movement that got top-down support, and there were Chinese youth outside China organised big protest meetings in all the cities around the world where the Olympic torch was travelling. There were protests in Seoul, in Paris, in London, San Francisco, in Canberra, and there were very tiny groups. They were there in force because they were supposed to be responding to, it was thought that there would be big numbers of people in so-called anti-China protests, because that's how the Chinese government characterises those who are raising the issue, for example, of Free Tibet or Falun Gong, that you are anti-China, Fanhua. And in fact, of one demonstration that I was able to listen to live from my office in Christchurch, the Canberra demonstration, there were quite small numbers of Falun Gong, Free Tibet and other supporters, and very large numbers of Chinese students wearing matching t-shirts with matching flags who'd been bussed in from all over Australia. And these students were, as I said, nobody made them, they made them go. It was a bottom-up movement. But you know, who paid for the buses? Where did the t-shirts come from? Where did the flags come from? And the connection goes right back to the embassy. And it's very interesting to me that Chinese young people living abroad would have organised like this, because one of the voices who's been very influential on understanding what was going to happen to the communist world has been Francis Fukuyama, his famous article, The End of History. And he had a paragraph in that really struck me when I read it. It struck me as terribly wrong, but I knew it would be very influential. And he argued that there were 30 or 40,000 Chinese young people studying in the West, and that when they came home, that they were going to be transforming China. And there we saw those young people still abroad, and what were they doing? They were defending, in their eyes, they were defending their country. And within China, there were big protests also time with this. And we've seen this again and again, that Chinese young people have really rallied around on these issues that the government has promoted as ones that are sort of the real core issues for China, and the core no-go zones in terms of censorship as well. So I think the answer to whether or not these policies has succeeded is shown by these kind of actions. So as I said, there's a whole lot of new techniques, and China has also looked to many other models for its modernisation of the propaganda system. And another important point to make is the depoliticisation of the public sphere. In the Mao era, everybody had to know the message. Everybody had to participate down tools when there's a political study session. Not now. Only a very small sector of the Chinese population will need to know the, Xi Jinping's new 4 comprehensives. And those are the armed forces, the party members, and the educated youth. That means the further up the education system you go, by the time you're at university level, you're going to have you'll have your political study class, or you'll have an exam, and you'll need to know these kind of phrases. But we often hear stories about when there are political campaigns in recent years where you can download a model essay for your contribution. There's a degree of cynicism about this kind of, even for these groups, about the extent to which they need to know the political message. So it doesn't mean that the rest of the population don't get a message at all. It's called, what they receive is called spiritual civilization, which sounds totally incomprehensible in English, but it's the message that helps to support and maintain social and political control. And one of the themes of spiritual civilization that you might have noticed is the re-emphasis on Confucian ideas, filial piety in particular. There are a whole lot of other aspects of Confucianism that support an authoritarian government. And patriotism is part of spiritual civilization approach, and that the Office for Spiritual Civilization is located in exactly the same spot as the Central Propaganda Department. They're one and the same, but for outside purposes, you will hear a lot more about the Central Propaganda Department. And often, as I said earlier, the Western media, when they're reporting on these things, they don't understand this distinction, and they overemphasize the political message in China, when in fact it's the depolitical message that's worth paying attention to. So I'm going to skip through to the end here now, because we're coming close to time. I want to hear some questions from you all. I just mentioned that Herbert Laswell stressed that effective propaganda always requires censorship. So while the message is depoliticised, while there's been a commercialisation of the media in China, Chinese people have a much more diverse and interesting cultural and media and education environment. Nonetheless, the boundaries exist and the no-go zones exist. And one of the ways in which those boundaries are maintained is through the tifa, or in English we could call it the framing, the ways, the things, the words in which you are required to discuss politically sensitive issues in China. And the nomenclatura continues to have an important role. One of the changes has been putting a lot of responsibility on the most senior leaders, for example, of a newspaper. The editor has to take personal responsibility for his own or her own journalists and their reporting, and but they do have a lot more leeway than they did certainly 20, 30 years ago for the content in their materials. So in conclusion, what I argued in my book, Marketing Dictatorship, and I think is still relevant to argue today, is what's so very interesting about China is that they are employing much of the same methodology that our own countries, modern industrialised societies, you can call them democratic if you want, use to maintain their political legitimacy, and that they use to mould our views and to regiment the public mind. And the CCP is using it to maintain their privileged position over Chinese society, and it's the Chinese constitution gives them that leadership role, but they don't take it for granted. They're continually engaging in the process of legitimation of their rule through the modernised propaganda system. And it's possible that the CCP will have been able to extend this privileged position over Chinese society and avoid having a multi-party election-based system, using some of the most undemocratic practices that come from modern Western societies. And the main point of difference that I see with Xi Jinping's China is the level of resources that he now has. And I think it's very clear from Xi Jinping's emphasis in these first 2 years of his rule that he believes, as did Deng Xiaoping back in the early 90s, that the party's legitimacy is resting both on those two hands, economic growth and propaganda and thought work. Thank you.